Thank you for joining us for Community Christian Church's study of the book of Revelation. This is actually week 21, and we're looking at chapter 13. But before we get into chapter 13, let's review chapter 12 first. Chapter 12, we saw a symbolic description of a war that's going on in the spiritual world, described as in heaven, between a great red dragon and a heavenly woman. The great red dragon represents Satan, and the woman represents the people of God, those who are faithful to God. The vision describes in symbolic terms the effort of the dragon to destroy both the woman, the people of God, and more specifically, the Messiah. It also describes how both are preserved from the wrath of the dragon and how war goes on in heaven and Michael defeats the dragon and tosses the dragon out of heaven. And then finally, the effort of the dragon once tossed down to the earth to destroy the church upon the earth. Now, this is not a vision of an event which will take place at the end. It's a vision in highly imaginative terms of the heavenly warfare that goes on between God and Satan, which has its counterpart in the history in the conflict between the church and demonic evil. As such, it represents, it transcends and goes beyond the usual categories of time and space. It is not meant to be a foretelling of history, but a representation of the ongoing struggle in the spiritual world that lies behind the events of human history. So that's chapter 12, and chapter 12 ends with these words. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. So he goes on to make war against God's people throughout the ages. Those who come to faith because of the first century church and the second century church, those are the children that Satan wages war against. So chapter 12 is this big overview of what's going on. And then let's get back to chapter 13. Let me read chapter 13 first, because it describes how Satan makes war against God's faithful people. So let me read through it, and then we'll go back and look at it verse by verse. Chapter 1. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head was a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but it had feet of those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opens its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, and all whose names have not been written in the book of life, the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, though whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs, it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast. It deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, who was wounded by the sword, yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. The number is 666. Okay, let's go back now and talk again about this verse by verse. So the dragon basically is now going to make war on God's people. And to make war on God's people, he stands by the sea and summons his instrument in the war against God's people. And that instrument is the beast, who already appeared back in chapter 11, verse 17, where it said this. Now then, the two witnesses had finished their testimony. The beast that comes from the abyss will attack them and overpower and kill them. So notice there, the beast comes out of the abyss, and here the beast comes out of the abyss. And basically, these are two different ways that are symbolic of evil and the source of evil. You know, in the ancient world, the sea was associated often with evil, and it was looked at as one of the big enemy of God's people. And so to rise out of the sea or to rise out of the abyss basically means much the same thing, to come from a source and place of evil, a place of demonic activity. Now, the beast is definitely related to a vision that Daniel had in chapter 7 of Daniel. And there, Daniel saw four beasts coming out of the sea. Notice the sea again. And in Daniel, the four beasts represented four different empires, four successive empires. And scholars disagree about which four they were, but they all agree that the beasts represented empires. And this beast is like the combination of all those, because it has what was symbolized by all the beasts of Daniel chapter 7 wrapped into one. And so he's identified in some ways with a leopard, some way with a bear, some way with a lion, and in some ways with the beast that had the 10 horns and the 7 heads. And it's interesting because Satan looks very much like that himself. Back in Revelation 12:3, it says, another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. And then back in 13:1, it says, the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. So notice there's a similarity there, and that's basically just to convey the concept that the beast is actually an earthly representation of 7. It's a little bit different because the dragon had 7 crowns on its heads, while the beast had 10 diadems or crowns on its horns. The 7 crowns on the dragon represents the fullness of power. The 10 crowns represents 10 kings, according to Revelation 7:12. But they don't play a significant role in this vision of the beast. What it really just reminds us is the fact that the beast has its origin in the dragon and answers the dragon and gets its power from the dragon. It also basically says that, you know, Satan doesn't really do his work openly as himself. He does his work kind of secretly between people. And John here is talking more than just human evil. This beast, this kingdom represented by the beast, is not just human evil. It's a kingdom that is represented by satanic evil. The modern world, like the ancient world, gives us lots of illustrations of worldly governments that attack the church. And it takes multiple forms, and it's taken multiple forms throughout history. The Babylonians and the Assyrians attacked the people of God, the nation of Israel at that time. Rome persecuted the church, and different empires throughout time have attacked Christians. So the beast has 10 crowns on its horn, which is kind of a curious place to put crowns, while Satan has them on his head, which would be normal. But I think here, the reason the crowns are on the horns is to convey the idea that they have their power to rule because of brute force, not because it was somehow an elected kingship or elected government ruler, but it was one who took possession of rule by being powerful and being strong and forcing its will on people. Also, by putting the crowns on the horns, it leaves the heads free for the blasphemous name. Now, it's not certain whether we should read names, so each of the heads have the same name, or names, which would indicate different names were on each of the heads. But either way, the names that are put there are names that show contempt for God. Well, again, what does the beast represent? Well, in Daniel 7, the beast represented kingdoms, not a specific person. The 4 beasts were 4 kingdoms. And we know that individuals make up kingdoms, but typically a kingdom lasts more than one king. There may be one king that got it going, maybe one that had it at its peak, one as it was in decline, but the real focus is there on kingdom. So primarily they are governments that are ungodly and persecute the followers of God due to satanic motivation. Governments that are inspired by Satan, although it's not always clear that we see a connection to him. For example, I don't know if you can think of, well, you probably can in ancient times, a government that was more wicked than Nazi Germany. But Nazi Germany didn't clearly worship Satan, but certainly Satan would be behind such a terrible persecution and what they did there. Again, governments are made up people. So in some sense, the beast, the totality of the government can be represented by an evil, by an individual, but realize that beast is being represented here, both as the empire and both as the political leaders of that empire. Now, the beast is often identified as the Antichrist, and we find the verses about the Antichrist in First John, in the letters of John. And in fact, that's the only place we find the phrase Antichrist in the New Testament. And here are the places that we find the phrase Antichrist. Again, I said it's only in John's epistles. In John 1, chapter 2, verse 18, we read this: "Dear children, this is the last hour. And as you've heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. This is how we know this is the last hour." So notice what John is saying here. He's kind of saying the Antichrist is going to come, like there's going to be one future big time Antichrist, but yet there are many Antichrists. In fact, there's some running around right now. And that's why we know this is the last hour. So here when we see this, we can see that the Antichrist is really someone who is opposed to God, someone who's anti-Christ. That's what anti means. It means to be against God. And we can see that there's going to be many of them. So probably some of these governments and kingdoms and nations throughout history have been Antichrist, but they've not been that final Antichrist government that we're looking for. I think 1 John 2:22 helps us. It says, "Who is the liar? It is whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That person is the Antichrist, denying the Father and the Son." Again, notice it's the denial of Jesus that makes the Antichrist. Then 1 John 4:3 says this: "But every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming, and even now is already in the world." So notice it's talking about the spirit of the Antichrist. So it's individuals, but it's also a spirit that can be the force behind a government or the force behind individuals. Well, in light of this, it's best to see the beast as a representative of a government, any government that opposes God, especially the final empire or the final government, which will intensely oppose God and its people. Kind of like the Antichrist on steroids. There's some of them that come along, but there's going to be one that is like the final and the biggest and the worst. Now, it's common to see the beast as representing the historical Roman Empire of the first century. And no doubt it was an Antichrist government and it was a manifestation of the beast, but it's not the final manifestation. That would be yet in the future. But Rome sets a kind of a good model of what it was like. It was almost a worldwide, it didn't really cover the whole world. I mean, China wasn't under the Roman Empire, but it was spread throughout that part of the world. It was full of power. It was full of might. It subjugated people. And it also got the government mixed in with religion. So the beast in its fullness will kind of be like the Roman Empire. The end time government and the Antichrist is probably thought of as being foreshadowed in certain ways by the Roman Empire and foreshadowed by other totalitarian states, especially when they start mixing politics and government and economy and religion all together, because that happens in some empires, and it's definitely going to happen in that final empire. Excuse me. So it says, each head had a blasphemous name. The beast claims to have divine power. And so the names that are going to be given and put on the beast are basically ones that are opposed to Christ, that basically claim for itself the privileges and title and position of God. Now, Paul talks about this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. But he doesn't use the word beast or antichrist. He uses another word for this. Let's read there. 2 Thessalonians 2:1. Concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by the teaching allegedly from us, whether by prophecy or by word of mouth or by letter, asserting that the day of the Lord has already come. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshiped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. So notice here the Antichrist, the beast, is talked about as being the man of lawlessness who will have to come. and he will oppose God. And that's really what the beast does, oppose God. Now, setting himself up in the temple, something that's a physical temple, or something that's setting himself up within the church, God's people. It's a spiritual temple that he's going to get an exalted place in. Well, the self-deification of the Antichrist has had precursors throughout history. Maybe the Roman Empire is the best example because the emperor got deified. And at first it started to happen that after the emperor would die, he'd be worshipped as a god. Julius Caesar, Augustus, Claudius, Titus, all those people were given divine names by the Roman Senate after their death. But later on, even time of John is writing, several emperors had used the name divus on their coins, which means divine, while they were still alive. And in the East, that's the eastern part of the Roman Empire, where Greek was the main language and Latin wasn't used as much, the coins had the term theos, which is the Greek word for God on it. And as we see in the letters to the 7 churches, the cities of Asia had vied for each other to get the honor of having a temple dedicated to Rome and a temple that promoted the emperor and worship of the empire. The most explicit claim to deity was made by Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96 AD, the time that John is writing, who demanded to be addressed by the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. So this is a deification of the state. It's a deification of the rulers. It happened with Rome, and although it's going to really be big in the last day, we've witnessed manifestations of that throughout history, especially in some of the modern totalitarian states, where you see big pictures of the president or our beloved leader all over the place, and people salute it, and they kind of worship it by what they say and what they do. And remember when Lenin died, he was put in a mausoleum in Red Square in a glass case so people could come by and pay their homage to him. So it was a worship-like activity that took place of these dictator rulers. Okay, let's push on to the 3rd verse. The wording of English may be a little bit misleading. It does not mean to say that one of the heads looked as though it was mortally wounded, but it was really not mortally wounded. What it wants to say is that it was wounded. It died. It took a fatal wound, but was healed. It was a wound that seemed fatal and was indeed thought to be fatal, but somehow it was healed and he came back to life. The interesting fact here is that the wound appeared to be mortal, and it was healed. And the words here are somewhat reflection of what was said about the lamb in chapter 5, verse 6. The lamb who had been slain, that would be Jesus, but came back to life. Here it's one of the heads that is wounded to death, but the death wound is healed. In fact, one of the heads that happens to, and then later on we see the mortal beast himself receives a mortal wound. So that kind of conveys the idea that you've got the beast as a whole, but he's also identified with the 10 heads that represent the beast. Everywhere in the book, we can figure out who could possibly have been powerful enough to actually slay the beast. And the only place we can see that is when the dragon is conquered. He's slain by the Lamb and together with the faithful testimony of the followers of Jesus. Furthermore, it's the event of the life, especially the crucifixion, the resurrection, and exaltation of Jesus that deals the final death blow to the dragon and the beast. And so we can see this teaching throughout the New Testament that Jesus is the one who is victorious over Satan, victorious over him. So the wound probably is to be thought of here as a wound that took place through the ministry of Jesus Christ, who put an end to Satan and defeated him. It's basically a fulfillment of the prophecy in Genesis that all Satan would strike the Messiah's heel, the Messiah would crush his head and destroy him. But how is it that it comes back to life? Well, I think what we see is even though Satan has been defeated and destroyed, he still is kind of hanging on and causing problems. So he's been defeated in the sense that his power is gone. He's no longer as strong as he used to be, and his end is definite, but he's still kind of making some last efforts to fight and attack. So the beast has been dealt a final blow by the cross of Jesus, yet he's still waging war until the final time for him to be completely, utterly uprooted and destroyed. So the beast, he can't beat Jesus, but he can cause problems. And together they cause problems until Jesus comes back again. Well, basically it tells us in verse 4 that men worship the beast and worship the dragon, for he had given authority to the beast. And so they see the beast as this wonderful thing, so powerful, so mighty, who can possibly fight against it? So in a sense, they worship the beast, but in doing so, they also worship the dragon. And this really is the goal here. The goal of that kingdom, that final kingdom, is to get people to divert their loyalty from worshiping God, from honoring God, making God the center of their life, to making the beast the center of their life, to turn from God and submit to the beast instead, which is really turning from God and worshiping Satan instead. The time of the Antichrist is a struggle for the souls of men. The beast will manifest its mighty power that he will convince the world that to resist him is futile. And so you might as well go along with him and do that. Let's go back again and look at some what Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 2:9 about the Antichrist. The coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. He will use all sorts of displays of power through signs and wonders that serve the lie, and all the ways that wickedness deceives those who are perishing. They will perish because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion, so they will believe the lie, and so they will be condemned who have not believed the truth, but have delighted in wickedness. So notice what goes on here. We'll see a little bit later when the second beast appears, specifically about how signs and wonders are used to deceive people. But notice here that there's power that takes place here, and people are deceived. So back here again, we see people worship the dragon because they've given authority to the beast. And they say, who is like the beast? That is almost like what was said in the Old Testament about God. Like, who is like Yahweh? Who is like our God? There's none like him because of the mighty things that he's done. And so people are giving to the beast what alone should have been given to God. That is worship and honor and obedience. Let's move on to verse 5. Here we see the beast was as given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise power for 42 months. And once again, this just highlights the fact that the beast has no power of its own. It's power given by the master. And John readers will ultimately know that all this power is only given by to Satan by God, that God only allows Satan to do these things. If God did not allow it, Satan couldn't do it. And that 42 months helps us emphasize that. It's a limited time of authority. He can't do it forever and ever and ever, but just 42 months. And every horrible and irresistible thing that the beast does, we got to remember it's only done because God allows it, and God is going to only allow it for a short period of time. And so believers are being encouraged by the thought that this suffering has been allowed by God, and it's not the beast who gets to decide when it's going to end. God will decide when it's going to end. The power is limited, though he speaks proud and blasphemous words. In the end, it will come to an end. 42 months is used in Scripture two ways. It's sometimes used to describe the period from the coming of Christ to his first coming until his second coming. That whole period we call the church age. And then sometimes it's used to describe that last intense period of persecution the church undergoes. Because during the whole time from Christ's first coming and second coming, Satan has been there trying to attack and destroy the church, pursuing the children of the woman. But it's going to get really intense during those last period of time. So it gets used both ways, of the entire period and then of the final period, the final aspect where things are getting a bit more intense. Well, here we see very specifically that the beast slanders the woman in verse 6. Slanders God. He speaks blasphemy against God. And it basically kind of helps us understand more specifically those names that we're putting on the heads. Now, to blaspheme doesn't mean curse, as it does in English. It really means to connect God or say something bad about God, to desecrate the divine name, to violate his glory or his honor as deity. And notice it's not just only God that's being blasphemed, but his dwelling place, that's heaven, and those who are in heaven, that's his people. So the blasphemy goes against God, his dwelling place, and his people, and it's basically really all against God. But one way you can blaspheme God is to blaspheme his people. When you blaspheme and dishonor his church, you also dishonor him. So whenever people regard the state, the government, as supreme, and they offer divine honors to the government, that's something that is not right. It's basically giving to a government, to a person, the kind of honor and glory that only should be given to God. And this was tough because you see, these people actually were being forced to do that. We might think that's strange in America with our separation of church and state, but there was no separation of church and state in first century Rome. The state ruled everything. The state was in complete control. And if the state says that you need to make a sacrifice to the emperor, you need to make a sacrifice to the emperor or pay the consequences. Goes on to say the beast was given power to wage war against God's people. Now, To wage war is used in different ways in Apocalypse and Revelation, but it doesn't never ever really mean a military campaign. But it does mean hostility and destructions of God's people in whatever manner and however it was thought best by the beast and however the beast may choose. So a lot of times waging war just means persecute, making life hard, try to get people to give up their faith, to turn from Jesus. And the phrase, though, to conquer, that refers even more than subverting their faith, but actually destroying them physically, taking their lives. However, we've got to realize that the conquering that's done here is not the final conquering because they remain faithful. That's why they get killed. So ultimately, they are the victors because they did not deny Jesus. Just like Jesus, even though he died on the cross, his death was a victory and he was resurrected because he fulfilled his mission. So the believers that are faithful to the very end, they are actually the ones who triumph, even though it looks like they lose. And that's what we see here in Revelation 12:11. It says that's the believers, triumphed over him, that's the dragon, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Notice they were triumphal because they did not shrink from the faith. They did not give up the faith, but they died instead of giving up the faith. And then here's something, Revelation 15:2. And I saw what looked like a sea of glass glowing with fire, and standing beside the sea, those who had been victorious over the beast and its image, and over the number of its name. So even though they fight and wage war, and even though they may conquer in the sense of killing people, they in the end, those who remain faithful are the victorious ones. The passage also gives us a sense of how complete the authority of the beast is. It was universal authority. It extends over every tribe and people and language and nation. And that's why people look at the final last kingdom, the last beast, the last Antichrist kingdom, to be a worldwide kingdom, because it has to be to extend over every tribe, people, language, and nations. And although, like I said, the saints may be conquered, put to death by the beast, the real victory belongs to them. Verse 8 says that all the inhabitants of the earth worship the beast, all those whose names were not written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. And when we see that phrase in the book, all the earth, we need to realize it's talking about all the inhabitants of the earth that aren't believers. It's all the whole world apart from those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. They're all going to worship the beast. But Jesus foretold us that this would happen. Then the last day, the signs and wonders would be performed to deceive even the elect, if that was possible. And once the Roman state had taken on religious significance, it was only natural that it should be worshiped, and it should begin to demand worship. To worship of the nation, to worship a government, is a satanically inspired perversion of secular authority, and it's an offense against the one true God, because it's the state claiming authority in a position that only God has. Although Rome had foreshadowed this, the situation in the future that under the Antichrist will transcend the kind of worship that the Roman Empire got. It's interesting, in the Roman Empire, the Jews were exempt from the demand to formally worship the emperor. They basically said these Jews are so devoted to their God, they'll rebel and they'll die rather than worship. So let's give them some substitute. They have to have a substitute way they can honor the emperor without actually worshiping him. But in the last days, no one's going to be exempt. Christians won't really be exempt, but they will exempt themselves by paying the price for their loyalty to Christ of giving up their lives. Well, in verse 9, we have something we saw earlier in Revelation in the letters to the seven churches, where it says, whoever has ears, let him hear. And if anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Now, verse 9, as I said, contains that serious admonition we heard earlier. And it basically is just saying, pay attention, open up your ears, understand what's going to happen. Don't be caught off guard by this, because there's going to be an Antichrist that's going to persecute those who are faithful to God, and will kill many, if not all, of those who are faithful to Jesus at the very end. Verse 10 is a little bit more difficult. So I think the best way to understand it is that it's really basically saying the way you respond to this kind of persecution in the end time is not to engage in warfare or to fight in a physical way. It's a spiritual thing. If anyone's going to go into captivity, it tells them that they cannot resist this in a physical form by violence. They can preach and teach and try to convert people and resist to their words, but not to engage in violence, because if you're going to go into captivity, it's going to happen. If you're going to kill, it's going to happen. But just simply endure, simply be faithful. What's called for is not a violent resistance of what the Antichrist is going to do, but just an endurance, a patient endurance and faithfulness on God's people, looking for Jesus to return and make all things new. With the impending persecution getting ready to break out on the church then and the church at any time, believers will need to meet it with steadfast endurance and unswavering faith. John's warning about the perils that face God's people serve to prepare them for those difficult days. At the close of the age, it will be to the church's advantages to be fully informed of Satan's increased activity. And this is one of the reasons why, even though it's popular, and I wish it was true, the view that the church is going to get raptured off the earth before Satan begins his most intense persecution against the church is just not consistent with Scripture. This review, I'm afraid, is going to people to have some false expectation that they won't need this patient endurance. They won't need to have the strong faithfulness, and they won't be ready. And I'm afraid not only will they not be ready for it and maybe be deceived by it because they think they shouldn't be here when it happens, some people may give up their faith and saying, the Bible said this wasn't supposed to happen to me, and it's happened to me, so I can't trust the Bible. Well, just be aware that there are other Christians who say we're not going to get raptured out, that we're going to have to go through the difficult times, the persecution, the hardships, and the tribulation. Well, we see here then the rest in chapter 13, and it talks about another beast. There are two beasts being talked about. The first vision was a beast that was primarily political, and it came out of the sea. The second vision of a beast rises out of the earth, and the second beast actually is a servant of the first beast. His sole objectivity is compelling people to worship the first beast. So as we look at this description, we can see that it's a sense something that the Roman Empire embodied, but it's yet future, is beyond the Roman Empire. So let's go ahead and read about that in Revelation 13, starting at verse 11. Then I saw a second beast coming up out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. Notice the two horns like a lamb, but speaking like a dragon. It's kind of a parody of Christ. Christ was humble. Christ was the lamb who was slaughtered for the sins of the world. He was innocent, but this beast, even though it's got some horns like a lamb, is actually a representative of Satan. It's just the opposite. It's kind of like perverting and polluting religion for evil means. It's basically taking religious beliefs and using those and manipulating those not to serve God, not to honor Christ, but to serve Satan. And it may appear like, but notice the voice is that of a dragon, which means what it communicates and what it tries to accomplish is evil. It represents religion employed in support of the beast, and the fact that it's the second beast is later called the false prophet helps us understand how religious it is in nature. The first beast represents civil power, satanically inspired, yes, but civil power. The second beast represents religious power, satanically empowered, employed to support civil power. Basically, it's using religious influence, religious teaching, religious practices to get people to worship the state. You know, the Roman Empire had imperial priests, had priests that their function was to offer sacrifices on behalf of the state and behalf of the emperor and get people to come to their ceremonies. And that's what happens here. The second beast does something very similar, tries to get religious groups to honor the state. We see this we've seen it, often happens that way. Hitler subverted much of the Lutheran church to support him and get them to back his war effort. In China right now, there's officially recognized government church, and the government church supports the government, encourage people to be good citizens and loyal and faithful to that. So this passage reminds us of Jesus' warning to watch out for false prophets. They come in sheep clothing, like a lamb with two horns, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves out to get us. Well, that beast, as we mentioned, he has no competitor to the first beast. He's not trying to take his place. The second beast is his henchman. He has no power of his own, but derives his power from his association with the beast. His single objective is to capture the religious loyalties of men for the first beast. And it's significant that in this language, it's pointed out that the beast is identified with one of his heads. The second beast is going to talk about the first beast and how he needs to be honored because one of his heads was wounded, was mortally wounded, but yet he was revived and renewed and in a sense resurrected. And as a result of that, that's a reason to give even more honor and glory to the beast. And we saw that the The man of lawlessness is going to perform signs and wonders, is what Paul said in Second Thessalonians. And here we see the same thing. The second beast will perform great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of people. As the beast is a parody of Jesus, he's also a parody of Elijah, because remember, Elijah was the one who brought down fire from heaven. But he brought down that fire from heaven for the purpose of destroying false prophets, not to be a false prophet. Here's a good point for us to remember what was said in Deuteronomy, way back in the Old Testament, and in the last of the 5 books of the law, or the Torah. Here's what Moses says: if a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces to you a sign or wonder, and if the sign or wonder spoken of takes place, and the prophet says, let us follow other gods you have not known, and let us worship them, you must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. The Lord your God is testing you to find out whether you love him with all of your heart and with all of your soul. It is the Lord your God you must follow, and him you must revere. Keep his commands and obey him. Serve him and hold fast to him. So notice what happens here is that even before this comes up, way back in the very beginning of the Bible, we are told that we should not be deceived by miracles. Yes, true prophets do miracles, but then they will also say things that agree with the Bible. False prophets may have the ability to do some miracles, but they will say things that are contrary to the word of God. So it isn't just the presence of the miracle or not, it's the presence of the miracle in agreement with the word of God. You know what? And that's what Paul said about the lawless. He will display works, counterfeit miracles, and he's not to be believed. Because of these miracles, people are going to believe. Because of these miracles, people will give their allegiance to the beast. But we've got to remember that these things in and of themselves do not indicate somebody is from God. Has to be consistent teaching with God's word. Well, the miracles will help him establish his position. And the main point of the false prophet is basically to get people to give their allegiance to the beast and thereby give their allegiance to Satan. Now, magic has played a role in almost every pagan religion. Sometimes it may be truly satanically inspired magic that's given to the false leaders of false religions. Other times, I think it's trickery. But we've got to realize that people on earth are not followers of God, and so they can be deceived by these things. And in the end, the beast can only really deceive unbelievers, because believers should be able to have the insight, the knowledge of spiritual truth where they would resist it. Now, of course, I'm afraid some may give into it, but we don't have to give into it. That's what the mark does. It gives us the ability to resist the false teaching. If anyone serves God with their whole heart, he's not going to be taken captive by these false miracles of the deceiver. But the one who really is not devoted to God may turn away. The second beast instructs his followers to set up an image of the first one. And it does something that it was kind of something that was big back in days. It was trying to get it sound like these images would actually be able to talk. And so that's something that the second beast gives to the image. Notice it says the second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast. And that would just kind of a way of saying it would do something to counterfeit a resurrection, to counterfeit that it had life. And that's kind of like a big deal, because giving life and creating life is something that only God can do. So doing this trickery or whatever that made it seem like it had life is another way in which the beast blasphemes God and saying that he's like God, he's supreme, he's all powerful. But again, it's going to cause those to worship the beast. But what about the true believers? Well, the true believers, they're going to be killed. It reminds us of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel, where they had a choice of either worshiping the image. Now, that image didn't speak that we know of, worshiping the image, or they were going to be thrown in the fiery furnace. And just like them, believers that are alive, when this image is set up, are going to have the choice, either worship or be slain. And the passage makes it clear that the beast speaks, that the image of the beast speaks and command those that will not worship him to be put to death. You see, it's not really just a religious conflict here. It's not really a religion and state conflict. It's really a conflict between Christ and Antichrist, between God and Satan, between the inhabitants of the earth who do not have their name in the Lamb's Book of Life and those who do. One group will worship the image and bow down to it. Another group will not, and they have to be faithful. And notice how widespread this effort to get people to worship the beast will be. All people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, are going to be involved here. And part of how they're going to show their allegiance is they're going to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads. Remember way back in Revelation 7, the people of God, right before the tribulation was going to take place, they get a seal on their forehead, marking them as God's special people so they would not get the divine wrath poured out on them. They were confirming that they would be witnesses to Christ and loyal to Christ. This mark is a counterfeit mark, but this seems to be something very clearly physical. Now, it could be an actual mark of the forehead or on the hand. It could be something else. The point is, though, that it's going to be something visible. We have two groups of people that are sealed. Some are sealed with an invisible spiritual mark for God. Others are sealed with some mark that's visible, but they show to be people who are followers of the beast. And this mark is important because without it, they are not going to be able to engage in business. They're not going to be able to engage in commerce. It's all people. And they need this mark because they need it for economic activity. Now, sometimes when we do Revelation, we can see some parallel in the first century or in the Old Testament, but there's no parallel to a mark like this required in order to purchase. But it will be a way to control people. You know, if the government says, unless you have this mark, you can't buy any food, that would be very compelling reason to give your allegiance to the government because you don't want to starve. And that's part of why you see sometimes people that are really concerned about giving the government too much power because they see it moving toward this phase. Well, our government may be too big, it may be too powerful, and it may someday morph or evolve into that final end time government, but we're not there yet. But I can understand people's reluctancy about the government getting more and more control and more power. Well, John says this all calls for wisdom. Let a person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. The number is 666. So John now gives the name of the beast in symbolic form, and he's using something that was used in the ancient world for numbers. And the reason is that neither Greek or Hebrew had a system of numbers. You know, the Latin had a system of number, those Roman numerals, and there is an Arabic system of numbers. We use the Arabic system of numbers, you know, now. But what happened for Greek and Hebrew, instead of using numbers, they use letters, where A would stand for 1, B for 2, C for 3, and so on. And thus, a name could be converted into the corresponding numbers. In fact, there's a inscription on the wall in Pompeii where the volcano erupted and kind of sealed the city. And on that wall, we find this kind of like graffiti. I love her whose number is 545. So the person wanted to express his love for somebody, didn't want to write the name, but knows the number so that someone could understand who he was talking about. Now, interpreters sometimes think 666 refers to Emperor Nero. Remember, Nero was very wicked. He is the one who set part of Rome on fire and then blamed the Christians for it, and therefore he persecuted the Christians and killed many of them. However, it doesn't normally when you add the normal Greek letters up, it's not 666, it's 1005. So what scholars do to get it to work is they say, well, no, it's not Greek. You got to use the Hebrew numbers. And if you do use the Hebrew language and use the numbers represented by Hitler's name and there, you will get the name Hitler. However, they've got to use a little bit different spelling of the word to make all that happen. I mean, how that happened. So people do all kinds of things. No one's really explained it real well, but people try to figure out that. One of the best ways to think of this probably is that it's not really the number of a man, but it might be the number of mankind. And you might say, well, why would you say that? Well, the number of Jesus is perfection, 777. 7 is the number of perfection, and 3 times would be like the Trinity. It's kind of like God is perfect. And so if you wanted to number something that is less than God, that against God, you would take away 1. So it'd be 666. It would be a Trinity, but a Trinity that falls short of God. And that's what some people think was meant by the 66 here. It doesn't so much stand for a one individual, but just simply highlights the fact that humanity as a whole falls short of God's standard. It's the mark of unregenerate man in his present evil condition, and it will be the mark that people will bear to indicate that they are in solidarity with the beast. A civilization without Christ is one that's going to be dominated by the evil one. It's going to be one in which sin will reign, where God will not be worshipped, but the state will be worshipped. People will be worshipped rather than giving the allegiance to Jesus Christ. So anyway, that's chapter 13, and we're going to wrap up here, and we'll pick up next week by looking at Revelation chapter 14. Thank you for joining us. God bless you, and we look forward to seeing you again.